I've mentioned before that very often an owner will have a geotech report prepared before the architect even begins its design. And so it's important to spend a little bit of time looking at what a geotech report might contractually look like. And that's where the AIA C103 and C202 come in. Now, the standard form geotech agreement is the C202, but as you can see from this slide, it incorporates by reference the C103. The C103 is just a generic form agreement between the owner and any given consultant. The C202 incorporates the boilerplate provisions from the C103 and adds to them certain geotech specific requirements. So we have to move back and forth between the C103 and the C202 in order to understand exactly the scope of what the geotech's agreeing to do. Now, in general, as you would expect, under the C103, which is the generic consulting agreement, consultant agrees to perform its services to a certain standard of care. And again, as we've talked about before, this is the sort of thing that can get negotiated up or down. I mean, probably not going to get negotiated much further down than this, but simply that the consultant will perform to the level ordinarily provided by similar professionals in the same locality under similar circumstances. That can be raised depending on what the parties are willing to agree to, what the geotech's willing to agree to, or any other consultant. Specifically, under the C202, the geotech agreement, geotech agrees to review certain information furnished by the owner and all of the laws, codes, regulations, etc. And here's a good example of an agreement not going into detail about all of the laws and codes and whatever that might apply, but basically putting it on the geotech to figure out what laws, codes, regulations might apply. And say, geotechnical engineer, thou shalt comply with all those things, whatever they may be. Now, moving back to the generic form agreement that has the boilerplate, you'll also notice that the consultant wants to say, okay, I'm relying on the accuracy of the information provided by the owner. This is similar to concepts we've seen in the owner-architect agreement, owner-contractor agreement, where nobody wants to take responsibility for the accuracy of information provided by somebody else. Now, it's possible to change that language in negotiations to say, essentially, I'm providing the information I'm providing as is, and it's on you to figure out if any of it's accurate. But that's not the position that's taken in the C103. The C103, like most of the other contracts, say, okay, whoever's providing the information, they're on the hook if it's wrong. That's what 2.5 is about. Now, while most contracts don't specify in detail all of the codes and regulations and whatnot that the contracting parties have to comply with, the geotech agreement does say at least that the geotech will perform the tests and explorations in accordance with ASTM standards, which are standard engineering protocols for this kind of work. And so that doesn't just leave it to the geotech to do whatever the geotech wants. There are certain standards the geotech has to comply with, and these get spelled out. In particular, the geotech has to go out, do the field exploration, look at the site, do test borings, for example, figure out what's underneath the surface as best as you can, understanding that the borings only show whatever the borings show. They don't show necessarily everything that's there. There might be toxic waste. There might be a burial ground. There might be any number of things that would be missed through a test boring. But the report that the geotech prepares is supposed to provide a decent idea about what all's out there, so that the rest of the design and construction process can be planned accordingly. It's important to know if there's rock or if there's water or whatever. You'll notice that, like the architect under the C202, that's the generic consulting agreement that's incorporated by reference into the geotech agreement, this geotech, as the consultant, retains the instruments of service. We've seen that term before in the context of the architect having the rights to all of the creative work of the architect. It's the same concept here, that any instruments of service generated by the geotechnical engineer remain the property of the geotech, and the geotech grants a license to the owner to use it for this particular project. But the owner doesn't actually own the instruments of service under this language. So the significance of the geotechnical report, the reason I focus on it as a particular consultant, is it's often what starts the design process. An owner has a piece of property, they want to build something on it, but they're not totally sure what's underneath the surface, so they commission a geotech report to figure out as best they can, in accordance with the different engineering standards, what the soil is comprised of, so that the report can then be handed to the architect, and the architect can review the geotech report and say, all right, this is what we're looking at under the surface, so this is how I'm going to design the foundations, etc. And those designs then are part of what's put out to bid, and the contractor sees the design, sees the geotech report, and makes its own calculations about how much it's going to cost it to build the project. So if the geotech report's wrong, there can be huge cost implications later on that will end up coming out, usually in the context of a differing site conditions claim and a request by the contractor for adjustment of its time, the schedule that it's expected to adhere to, or the cost that it's going to charge.